The Isles of Scilly, a remote and rugged archipelago in the North Atlantic. We're on a voyage to discover its extraordinary history on the edge of Britain.
We need to get going.
Thank God we're through there. That was absolutely terrifying.
Today, these islands are famed for their natural beauty, but dig a little deeper and they have a fascinating story to tell.
It's clear that our forebears attached such great importance to a place like this.
It would have been unrecognisable.
This was about as impregnable as money could buy.
I wouldn't enjoy navigating around here on my own.
A lot of navigational hazards, a lot of shipwrecks.
They'd been a couple hundred metres further south.
They'd have missed it all.
We'd have never heard of them.
It looks like she was potentially involved in the illegal slave trade.
Any possibility of getting something for nothing, they would make the most of it.
One of the most perfect star-shaped Renaissance forts ever built.
Whoever got there first got the commission.
This is absolutely central to their way of life.
From ancient lands to ocean battles, this is an island history like no other. West Cornwall, a wild and remote frontier where life and land are shaped by the sea. But 28 miles to the west there's a place even more exposed. The Isles of Scilly.
The Isles of Scilly is a place I've always wanted to explore, not just because of the subtropical white beaches and gardens, but because they are full of extraordinary history. But when it comes to sailing around here, even though I love boats, I'm completely out of my depth. So that's why I've teamed up with Conrad for what I think is going to be quite an adventure.
Conrad Humphreys has sailed 3 times around the world, but there are still new places for him to discover.
In the 25 years I've spent as a professional yachtsman, I've sailed in hundreds of locations. But one place I've never explored is the Isles of Scilly.
Scilly is a group of more than 140 different islands and rocks, of which just 5 are inhabited. And we're going there in Conrad's historic boat, Bounty's End, a replica of the lifeboat used by Captain Bligh after the mutiny on the Bounty.
Well, listen, Conrad, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Not only do I love any opportunity to get out on an old, beautiful old replica of an 18th century boat, it's the way to see the Scillies and investigate the history and archaeology.
There's some incredible places to see, little nooks and crannies that we can get into.
Between here and North America is open ocean, the wild North Atlantic, bringing in storms that have battered this coastline for centuries. Low pressure systems are a constant threat to sailors. But this unique setting has also brought opportunity. We're going to explore how people survived here and the challenges they faced. The islands sit at a crossroads of 3 important trading routes: the Irish Sea, the Bristol Channel, and the English Channel. People have travelled to Scilly for thousands of years, both passing through and settling, and they've left their own history, myths, and fantasies.
Legend has it that when you sail from Cornwall to the Isles of Scilly, you cross the lost land of Lioness. A fertile, bountiful place of prosperous towns and no less than 140 churches. It was home to Tristan, one of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, but then the story goes that it was lost beneath the waves. Apparently in the 11th century a rogue wave came across and just swamped it, and that was the end of it.
Okay, that's fascinating, isn't it? I thought it was just referred to sort of King Arthur's mythical kingdom, but I didn't realise it was meant to be, well, that's beneath where we are now.
It's, yes.
It's down there somewhere. But yeah, because you read, poets love it. Tennyson used to write poems about this kind of magical land where the kings were good and the people lived well and there was plenty. Between Land's End and Scilly, what kind of depths are we talking?
Anywhere between 50 and 400 metres.
Right.
I mean, probably around the continental shelf, we're mostly around 200 metres. So it's been quite some waves to have formed it.
I suppose even though it's a myth, there's no truth to that particular story. What we do know is that sea levels have risen and formed not that much over the last few thousand years, and communities on Scilly have to reinvent themselves, move different locations. It's a dynamic environment, it's a place of change here.
I love the idea of somehow there being this kind of land bridge between Land's End and Scilly.
Well, I bet the people of Scilly are glad there is not a land bridge. Keep people like us away.
The shape of these islands has changed over thousands of years. A recent historic environment survey concluded that 9,000 years ago, Scilly was mostly a single island that was gradually inundated by rising sea levels in the Bronze Age to create the landscape and coastline we know today. Archaeologists have found some stone walls and other remains in parts of the archipelago that are now underwater.
Our first stop is Bar Point on the north of St Mary's, the largest island. It's the site of some fascinating archaeology dating back to the Bronze Age and some of Scilly's earliest inhabitants. But first, we have to get Dan ashore.
The charts, I mean, they're detailed, but they don't have every single tiny little navigational hazard, do they? As we get near the shore, are you happy with their approach here? No obvious rocks?
Let's have a quick look.
Is it looking sandy or rocky?
I think it's sandy.
Yeah, that's a good sign.
So I'm going to lose this sail now. We're quite actually coming in here with quite a bit of pace.
Nice and sandy.
Big push.
Okay, there we go.
Good man. Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Only around 2,000 people live on the Scillies. That means it's wonderful because lots of places like this where you can land and it feels really wild and uninhabited. But in fact, there has been human habitation activity here for thousands of years. And the evidence is all around us, if you know where to look.
While Dan goes exploring, I'm off to find a safe haven for bounty. The islands are exposed to weather systems in every direction, so there's not that many places to find shelter. I'm just arriving in Hewtown, St Mary's, and this is definitely the safest harbour on the island. So, really good that bounty's arrived. Sailors have come here to Hewtown for centuries to seek shelter from powerful Atlantic storms. Today it's a bustling modern harbour full of boats taking tourists and locals around the islands and back to the mainland. It's a great place to moor up while Dan discovers the earliest evidence of human habitation here.
This is great. I've wanted to see this for years. This is one of the classic Bronze Age burial sites for which the Scillies are absolutely famous for. They're internationally renowned. This is a so-called entrance grave, and there are many examples of these across Cornwall, up into southwest Scotland, Brittany. I've seen one in the Channel Islands as well. But in Scilly, we have an enormous concentration of them. The majority of all the known sites are right here on this little speck on the map. It tells you something about what was going on these islands in the Bronze Age. This one was built 4,000 years ago, Bants Carn, and it's one of the finest examples. It was a big, round mound, probably 25 metres across. Most of it rubble and earth above a stone-built rectangular burial chamber. And here there was a narrow entranceway coming in. Big stone slabs here, the roof is now gone sadly, but you get a sense of it here. You'd have come through this entrance chamber into the burial chamber itself. And just look at these beautiful capstones here. 4 enormous slabs that form the roof of this burial chamber.
The Bronze Age burial sites date to a period when the Isles of Scilly were changing shape. It's believed that it was built after some of the flatter, fertile land had already been covered by the sea. On high points like this, those early inhabitants came to venerate their dead.
Excavations here, but also elsewhere, have found the remains of pots with ashes inside, the remains of members of the community that would be interred here, having been cremated elsewhere. And they also may have had a sacred function that we don't really understand now. It's clear that our forebears attached such great importance to a place like this, but we still know so little about them. There's a real mystery here.
But you can see why the people of Bronze Age Scilly chose this location. This burial mound, originally 4 metres tall, would have been visible to everyone travelling by land and sea, a powerful, visible memorial to the dead. People continued to settle the islands throughout prehistory, making use of its rich seas and relatively mild and fertile climate and landscape. Now that Conrad has moored Bounty, we've arranged to meet up at another exceptional prehistoric location just down the hill from Bant's Cairn. Not a burial site, but an Iron Age settlement first built over 2,000 years ago, Halangi Down.
Hey Dan,
My
you
shoes!
forgot your shoes. There you go.
Yeah, I need those. Lovely.
This is something else, isn't it?
It's a really good site, this one. It's magical.
And you know, just that walk up from the beach there, just amazing.
Well, and I think actually that walk is deliberate because there was a settlement further down near the sea, we think, and they would have abandoned it because they were sick and tired of getting battered by storms. During the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, that sea level's rising a bit. They move up the hill and they build this kind of 300, 400 BC. And you can imagine stone buildings, turf roofs huddled together, big walls to keep out that classic southwesterly wind, animals here, families living here. And then going up the hill, they're building a bit later. And so they're actually here until the early medieval period, sort of 700 AD after the Romans have left. So they're here really for about 1,000 years.
Incredible. And so fishing, bit of farming.
That's right, surviving anyhow they could, really. And so, yeah, definitely shellfish, definitely fishing when the sea let them, farming, I think a bit of foraging. I think you've just got to place a lot of bets in that period and hope that not all of them fall over at the same time.
From above, we can see the shape of the village and its 11 stone-built houses, all interconnecting and surrounded by small fields and enclosures where livestock were kept and crops grown.
We do know it feels very remote, but in fact we found evidence of trade with Britain and even Western Europe here as well. So,
And what, in the form of?
pottery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so actually there would have been some contact with the rest of Europe as well. People were sailing from here to the mainland. Can you believe that?
My forebears.
Your forebears.
Yes.
Proper sailors.
Wow.
Incredible how many of them never returned.
With none of the mod cons, you know, no early warning of weather systems that have just had to take what came.
Yeah.
Very, very, very difficult.
While Conrad gets Bounty ready for a sail, I'm going to explore the houses to see how people lived out here on the very edges of the Roman world.
This is one of the later built dwellings, and you can see a series of little chambers leading off this entranceway here. You can see the way these wonderful stones piled one on the other. They have survived the centuries and give you a sense of the shape of these buildings. I think the small chambers would have been important because they were easy to heat, to keep the warmth in, which is an important consideration if you've got to survive a Scilly winter. Interesting feature here in the middle. I wonder if, it's tempting to say this is a hearth, but the way that it's sunk down, it's recessed. I think this could be drainage connecting to the drain out there. So perhaps this was an area for animal husbandry and they could clean out all the muck and that would get drained away down the hill and into that bigger sewer there. And these are quite famous at this particular site. There's lots of alcoves, very small little rooms off the sides of the bigger rooms. And archaeologists think these could have had a sacred function. They could have been a place where idols or statues of divine figures were kept. Or, of course, could have been a storage unit.
People living on Scilly from the Bronze Age to the early medieval period were existing on the margins of the wider world. They had both the advantages and disadvantages of isolation.
They would have been so resourceful. They had to be farmers, they had to be builders, they had to be carers, they had to be fishermen, sailors. They're so versatile.
So versatile. I mean, I'm a sailor. I know how to navigate around these islands, but of course, we're used to modern navigational aids which tell us, within a couple of meters where we are. Every single manoeuvre around these islands, they would have been having to sort of double check, looking at flagstaff poles and all sorts of things, stars and the sun, and it's really, really difficult to actually not run into trouble here. Often this place, when you're on the fringe of the Atlantic, you're in the mercy of the weather and the conditions. We've been really lucky to have sort of quite benign conditions. We can see all of the islands, we can get to everywhere we want to.
Well, I've been very lucky because you've taken me to all the archaeological sites that I want to check out, so that's great. And hopefully the weather holds and we can, there's so much more to see.
Calm it may be today, but in these waters it's always wise to work out exactly where the hazards lie.
Yeah, so one of the challenges we've got is not so much the islands, it's all the hundreds and thousands of tiny little rocks, some of which won't even be charted on here. So if we look at St Agnes, what is a lovely little spit and a beach in between actually has two very dangerous rocks on the way in, the calf
And the cow.
and the cow. And of course at high tide they're covered.
But only by a bit.
But only by a bit.
So you look out at the sea, think that's all safe and nice, and then there's a little ship-killing rock just underneath the surface.
And there'll be little rocks like that everywhere, of which these charts are fantastic, but they're not going to pick up all of that detail.
For me, looking at this map, what's so interesting is the yellow is land, the green is stuff that at low tide becomes land, but at high tide is covered up. So the Isles of Scilly are very, very different depending on the time of day that you approach them, right? Sometimes there's isolated islands, other times there's almost one huge sort of landmass that you can move around.
That's right. So at a spring high tide, this landmass diminishes probably by more than 50%.
That's crazy.
And of course at a spring low tide, you can almost walk between all of these places, and actually very, very difficult for boat to get around.
As a sailor, that brings you opportunity, but also danger, right? Because the opportunity is that you can use the tide to get in and explore all these places. But the danger is, if you get it wrong, you end up sitting on a sandbank or a rock for the next 6 hours.
Absolutely, absolutely. For this sort of pilotage and navigation, it is incredibly useful to have you here as an extra pair of hands, and we're not withstanding, if we need to push the boat off or just looking over the side for rocks. I wouldn't enjoy navigating around here on my own because you'd be constantly on high alert.
In the 19th century, the western approaches to the English Channel were some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Any sensible captain of a large ship sailing through these waters would get help to navigate through the hidden rocks and shoals. The pilots here on Scilly were famous for their local knowledge and skills.
So we're not making much progress. The wind seems like it's coming out of that channel now, doesn't it?
Are you up for a bit of ride?
Yeah, of course, always.
Sometimes, when the wind dies, this is your only option.
What about drifting? That's an option. Doing nothing. Calling for help. Waiting.
It's not long before our efforts are put to shame. Wooden rowing boats have been part of Scilly's history since ancient times. Pilot gigs are the most recent variation. Today, racing them is a thriving summer sport, and there's no better time than a summer's evening to see the rowers in action.
There's a lot of activity in here tonight. What's happening?
Wednesday nights is our ladies race night. Currently in the world of gig rowing, ladies rowing is absolutely booming, and we couldn't love it any more on Scilly at the moment. We've got a record number of boats starting races each week. We've got 13 gigs racing each week. We're struggling to fit them all on one start line at the moment. It's incredibly competitive.
What is it with the culture of gig racing in Scilly? It's just something that you always associate with the place.
You could almost say we're the home of gig rowing. It's been around on Scilly for 200, 300, 400 years. Families started using these as, they were originally pilot vessels for taking pilots out to ships coming into the British Channel. The racing originated from who could get their pilot out to the ship the fastest. So that's where racing started.
It's just whoever got there first.
Whoever got there first got the commission. Got their pilot on the boat first, they got the commission for the ship going up the channel. So that was that's how the racing sort of informally started, and then after that it progressed to regattas and racing all over the country.
It's a narrow hull, so it's fast.
Yep.
But it's pretty seaworthy as well.
They are.
Yeah.
The older boats generally are built anywhere between 28 foot and 32 foot. All modern gigs now are taken off a gig that was built in 1838, the Treacherous, which is a Nuki gig. So any boats built now for racing specifically only are built at 32 foot on the lines of that boat. But we've got gigs in here that range from 28 foot. The bonnet, which is 190 years old, is 30 foot long.
This one's 190 years old?
Yeah, just about. She was built in 1830, so she's actually approaching 200 years old in a few years' time.
So this one's old enough to have actually been used in that original.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
This predates the racing.
This does, yeah. It was originally a St Martin's gig and was used for pilotage. It supposedly did over 25 trips to Roscoff smuggling back in its day. So she's got quite an incredible history. Really loved boat around the islands.
So they drove this over to northern France as well for smuggling?
Yeah. The customs agency banned them from being 8-oared, which a few were originally because they couldn't catch them back in the day. So 6-oared.
So on a calm day like this, it would be, there's an opportunity, let's go over to France.
Go.
Bring back some duty free.
Get as much as they could.
Would these also be the boats that the brave islanders would go out and rescue the stricken ships in?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The Golden Eagle is a gig that has got mountains and mountains of rescues to her name. It's saved hundreds of people, salvaged a lot of goods in its time as well.
Well, we're going to come along and watch the start. We'll give it our best shot in bounty, see how we fare against you guys.
Good luck to you.
See you out there.
See if you can keep up.
I've always heard about gig racing, but I didn't realise the extraordinary history that's part of the whole thing. I absolutely love it.
Absolutely massive.
My new favourite sport.
I mean, it's huge here, not just because it had, tradition, it had, drama, but look at it. They're out enjoying themselves racing for a serious prize.
And they're off to St Agnes. It's going to be hard work tonight.
Yeah,
it's a long old race.
But there's some incredible history with these boats.
And I think it's very moving. I think it's very poignant. These were the boats that would go out and rescue crews of stricken ships. They were boats that might go pick up a few bits of valuable items that were floating around as well. But this is absolutely central to their way of life on this.
It was, and also, a hugely important service, rowing out to, trying to win the prize to get to, the job of bringing these ships in. That was their key role.
And as we've seen, you're going to pay for the pilot, aren't you? There's no chance if you're a foreign ship coming into these waters seeking shelter that you're going to try and work your way through. You're going to pick up a local and get them to stand next to you as you're helming into these anchorages. With light winds and just 2 oars, we've no chance of keeping up with the gigs. You can just imagine them 150 years ago racing out to grab a lucrative pilotage contract, or running ahead of the duty men laden with contraband. They're a living reminder of the extraordinary history of these islands, connecting land and sea, as people from prehistoric times onwards have built lives and cultures on the fringes of the Atlantic Ocean. In the next episode, we go in search of the shipwrecks that made the Isles of Scilly feared by mariners for centuries. The Isles of Scilly are notorious for the stormy conditions on the edge of the Atlantic. Wave-lashed rocks waiting to catch mariners. But for our visit, there's just a whisper of wind.
You do the forward one, I'll do this back one.
Oh yeah,
I would get the sheet off, just keep hold of the clue. It's not an easy boat to tack. Keep it sort of sheeted on.
oh, it's a good feeling.
That's it, you got it.
So this one here.
Yeah, so that one there.
The Isles of Scilly are known for their natural beauty, but they're also famous for something else: shipwrecks.
We're going to explore just why the Isles of Scilly were so treacherous.
These are some of the most dangerous waters in the world. There have been more than 1,000 recorded shipwrecks around Scilly, and many more we don't know about.
We're sailing from Hewtown on St Mary's right out to the historic Bishop Rock Lighthouse in the far west of Scilly.
So it doesn't feel too bad today, right? What wind is this?
We've got this high pressure moving over us, characterised by quite light winds and quite flat seas. I mean, it's quite a welcome place for sailors at the moment.
And the wind's blowing from over there, whereas usually it's a howling gale from that way.
Yeah, that's right. We've got these sort of light southeasterlies. The water's completely calm. There's no breaking waves out on the rocks.
On a day like this, it's hard to imagine that whatever the weather, sailing around these islands, you're never far from danger. These waters are a maze of narrow channels and jagged rocks.
That is bow rock, and if you can imagine a big lump like that, but under the water, well, just behind us, literally just a few hundred metres behind us there, is Spanish Ledges, one of the most infamous reefs on Scilly, right in the middle of the main channel coming in here, and so yeah, incredibly dangerous.
That might be eye-catching, but the real hazard is actually Spanish Ledges just there.
It is, and in fact, you know, what we have here is a leading line, which is quite critical as you're coming in here, because on both sides of the channel you've got reefs a little bit like that.
I'm trying to see the bottom. I think I can start to see a few different colours down there.
Just north of Spanish Ledges is another hidden and treacherous reef, Bartholomew Ledges. Thankfully, it's marked these days.
This is the one I've wanted to come here because this is the oldest known identified shipwreck in the Scilly's 1550. And they've recovered a few lead ingots, trading ship probably.
When was it discovered?
Not until 1978. A lot of the discoveries are late 20th century. Before then, obviously, marine archaeology was in its infancy. So it is a plumb right in the middle of that channel, isn't it? It could not be in a worse place if you're trying to trade with St Mary and Tresco and everything.
One man knows more about Scilly shipwrecks than anyone else. Former Royal Navy diver Richard Larn.
Somebody counted them once, 135 rocks out in the Western Rocks, sticking up and that have caught ships at some stage or other.
Richard has dived many of the sites around the islands and written extensively about what he found.
The Scillies are notorious, aren't they? A lot of navigational hazards here, a lot of shipwrecks.
That all boils down to the location, because the islands are 11 miles wide east to west, 6 miles north to south. That covers an area of about 66 square miles. And they are plonked right in the middle of where 5 major shipping routes all emerge. And in the days of sail, when you didn't have a choice, the wind had to be in the right direction or you didn't go where you wanted to go. They would come to the Isles of Scilly and park, literally. So Scilly's became an enormous ship park, literally. And it's been that way for 1,000 years.
And a few of those ships would have hit things and sunk.
Yes, because they came in at night, in fog, didn't want to pay for a pilot, thought they knew better, thought they knew best. They had a chart that was out of date.
One of the most infamous shipwrecks on the islands happened in May 1875. The SS Schiller, a 3,500-ton passenger steamer, went down in thick fog.
Schiller is a classic shipwreck story, dense fog at night, liner going to Hamburg from America, getting lost off the Bishop Rock there, and going ashore on one of the many reefs that we've got there, Rotaria Ledge. The Scilly accounted for about 270 people lost, plus the crew.
One of those who died was Louise Becker. She was emigrating to Germany with her wealthy husband. When Richard dived on the wreck, the team he was with found some of Louise's personal possessions.
This is part of Louise Becker's dowry, I suspect, because she was obviously taking all her valuables to Hamburg because she wasn't going back to the States. And on the side here, there's we've got her initials there, LB Louise Becker, and you can see here we've got spoons and sugar tongs and all sorts of little bits and pieces. And so this is a very poignant story in a way, because when you dive on shipwrecks, you find lots of things that belong to the ship. Sometimes you find personal effects, but you seldom know who they belong to. And in this case here we've got probably what was part of her wedding dowry.
This picture shows one of the lifeboats from the Scilly on the beach at Hewtown the days after the wreck. These other items recovered from the Scilly all provide an insight into life on board, right down to the furniture on deck.
It's always fascinating to me how a mighty ship over 100 metres long, thousands of tons in weight, carrying hundreds and hundreds of people, can be transformed just a few seconds into smashed pieces of wreckage. Bits of flotsam and jetsam floating off, corpse-strewn waters, and the things that survive, the tiny relics like this bench here which once sat on the deck of the Scilly. It's not much, but it's a poignant reminder of a once great ship.
We've reached the area where the Scilly went down, the notorious Western Rocks, a place that strikes fear into the heart of mariners.
The Western Rocks stretch over 10 square miles, many hidden just beneath the surface. If you're unlucky enough to hit them, they can tear a boat to pieces. I'm cautiously edging Bounty through on a falling tide.
All fine ahead?
Yeah, you got good depth. I'd say 6 metres or so.
This is the sort of place that sends shivers down my spine, and in rough weather you do not want to be here. Even today, in calm conditions like this, I'm on edge.
Right, Conrad, you've got something off the starboard bow that looks a bit shallow. Yeah, and then you can come back round to starboard now.
Yep, coming round.
I can see something ahead. I'd actually come very slight to starboard, actually.
Yep.
I've got water ahead of me now.
There's wave breaking on the other side of it, that's my only concern. Reckon we can go through there?
We can have a look.
As long as there's nothing that's going to surface.
Don't think so. This place is a nightmare.
But you just would not want to find yourself here in the dead of night. It's absolutely terrifying.
It really is. It's sort of scary enough just when messing about what we're doing now. The idea of hitting this in a big gale in the middle of the night is just extraordinary. I never thought I'd be able to get this close to these famous rocks, this infamous maritime graveyard. I never thought we'd be able to get in this close and really explore it.
Because the conditions are quite calm today, we can visually see the depth. Of course, in terrible conditions, you wouldn't have that luxury. Thank God we're through there. That was absolutely terrifying.
Well, I'm glad it was your boat, not mine, but you seem quite bullish about it. Well, Conrad, I think I owe you a massive thank you. I've always wanted to come out and visit the site of some of the most infamous shipwrecks in history, the Western Rocks. Usually quite hard to get to.
Really hard to. We've been, well, quite lucky because it's so calm today, but we're also at low tide, so you can just see the sheer scale of these rocks. The wrecks that have hit here Would they have seen what we're seeing now? Probably not.
A lot of mariners, the last sight they've seen on Earth were these rocks just covered in white water, just suddenly emerging out of the mist or the night in front of them.
Probably even hearing that horrible kind of splintering sound of wood being torn apart by the rocks, and then thinking, that's it, what do we do here? I mean, you know, there's nowhere to go really.
It's just one vast landscape, seascape, just punctured by so many rocks. This is one of the world's great graveyards for ships.
One of the most tragic and consequential shipwrecks happened at the start of the 18th century, when 4 Royal Navy ships hit the rocks.
22nd October 1707, that terrible night, probably the worst sort of disaster of this kind in Royal Navy history, and I think that's where HMS Association, the flagship, hit. Sir Cloudesley Shovel, a very celebrated admiral, war hero. He crashed straight into that rock. Within minutes, he and the entire crew had perished.
3 other ships, the Eagle, Romney and Firebrand, also struck the rocks and sank. Another ship, the St George, hit the rocks but managed to float clear with minimal damage. Over 1,400 men died that night, including Sir Cloudesley Shovel.
As a wooden boat owner, you must have thought a lot about the effect of driving one of these into the rocks.
If they're in a raging gale being driven onto those rocks, these boats would have been just like matchwood. And of course these big oak frames just ripped apart by those, you know, nasty, sharp, jagged rocks. Absolutely terrifying. And they were coming from
From the Mediterranean.
And how did they end up, perhaps, you know, on the wrong side of the channel?
I think it was terrible weather. Several days in a row they weren't able to get their readings and they just miscalculated where they were. They thought they were much closer to the coast of France. And then there's the eyewitness accounts. The association just simply, one minute it was sailing along, the next minute it just turned turtle, smashed straight into the reef and was gone.
As the disaster unfolded, the islanders were powerless to help.
Whilst St Agnes is not that far away, in a westerly gale, there's no way they could have got out here to really be effective. They would have had to wait for the conditions to calm down a bit before they could come and lend assistance. So, you know, perhaps heartbreaking for them to just sort of know that this is unfolding overnight and powerless to do anything about it.
You know, and the weird thing is, they'd been a couple hundred metres further south.
They would have missed it all.
We'd have never heard of them.
Shovel and his crew knew they were near the mouth of the English Channel, but not how close or which sides of the Isles of Scilly they were. In nautical terms, they didn't know their longitude. It was a major challenge for sailors 300 years ago.
So they knew how to calculate latitude because it's basically just the angle between the sun and the horizon. That's how you know how far north and south you are on the planet. But longitude is much harder. Now remind me why.
It's a lot harder because you need to be able to keep an accurate time from your prime meridian, which would be Greenwich. So having an accurate timepiece was absolutely critical, but on a vessel that's being tossed around by waves, obviously it's going to interfere with the sort of devices of the clock itself. So that was the real challenge, to come up with a chronometer that could withstand the rigours of being at sea.
And chronometer is just a posh word for a watch.
It's a posh word for a watch, yes.
So why do you need that when you're doing longitude?
So if we just draw our planets here, planet Earth, we're familiar with our lines of latitude.
Okay, so that's like the equator.
Yep, and here's our line of longitude. And in this particular case, we're going to put Greenwich here, Greenwich London here. Now the Earth is spinning around, and it's spinning in 24 hours, 360 degrees. Yeah. So if we are then to divide our planet up into segments, much like you would have orange segments, if we know our time of noon here at Greenwich and we can calculate our time of noon, let's say 1 hour later, and if we know the difference between these, an hour later is 15 degrees. We can work out our longitude through knowing the time difference.
You need to know the time in Greenwich. You can easily work out noon where you are because just looking at the sun when it reaches the zenith.
Yep.
And it's the difference in time between those shows how far the Earth, how far west of Greenwich you are.
Exactly that.
So actually it's not about the kind of physics of looking at the sun, it's just about time. You've got to have Greenwich Mean Time on your ship wherever you are in the world.
Timing was the critical thing that needed to be solved.
You only need that timepiece when you realise that's the key to knowing where you are on the planet.
Yep.
The 1707 disaster was a huge incentive to finally solve longitude. It's one of the great scientific stories which we can't do justice to on a trip around Scilly, but in a nutshell, some of the finest minds in the country, including Sir Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley, all had a go at it. But it was a humble carpenter turned clockmaker from Yorkshire called John Harrison who finally solved the problem. After years of endeavour, in 1759 Harrison invented a marine chronometer that was able to keep time with Greenwich whatever the conditions at sea. Solving longitude made sailing around Scilly a lot easier, but it didn't stop the shipwrecks altogether. The islands and rocks were still dark and extremely hard to navigate.
It's very weird, isn't it, Conrad? Because the Scilly's now, everyone thinks it's this sort of holiday mecca. It's beautiful and sandy and friendly pubs and cottages to rent. But this would have been a place that would have filled mariners' hearts with fear.
Yeah, and it wasn't well lit, there wasn't a lot going on here. So, if you suddenly find yourself in amongst it, how do you actually get out? It's like a maze. They would have come round the corner, I think, of the Atlantic coast, knowing they've got this obstacle, not entirely sure where it was.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And skirting around it, hoping, they're not going to see any breaking waves.
Ships continued to founder on the islands, leaving a trail of destruction that can still be explored at the Valhalla Museum on Tresco. It's full of salvaged figureheads and other artefacts from sunken vessels.
As well as having a world-famous garden here, you've got one of the most famous international collection of bits off shipwrecks as well.
There were a lot of wrecks here, so the collection was put together in 1870.
Head gardener Andrew Lawson is my guide. He's taken me straight to an extraordinary piece of evidence from Sir Cloudesley Shovel's doomed flagship.
And this came off the Association.
Yeah, but it's a French cannon.
Yeah, I can see that. It's got the French fleur-de-lis, it's got Louis' insignia here.
Yeah, it's an 18-pounder, but actually the cannon probably weighs over 1.5 tons, and it was being brought back as spoils of war. So there were 2 of them. The other one is now in the Tower of London. Both of them bought off the wreck in the 1970s.
Tony, tell me about this one here. Who's he?
This is the Friar Tuck. So it's a tea clipper wrecked in 1863 off St Mary's.
So like the Cutty Sark, a big tea clipper carrying tea from China.
It was based in Liverpool, I think, but it's a ship that was wrecked off St Mary's, and they managed to save quite a lot of the tea from that.
Must have been a big event, a wreck, because suddenly you've got luxury goods just floating around the seashore and everyone's just collecting it up.
And life was so poor at those times here that any possibility of getting something for nothing, they would make the most of it.
There are even parts salvaged from some of the most famous warships of the Napoleonic Wars.
This one's a fairly spectacular sternboard.
Right, so that would have been on the back of the ship, on the stern. Yeah. Which ship's it from?
It's from the Colossus.
Not Nelson's Colossus.
Nelson's Colossus.
Ah.
Yeah, wrecked in 1798.
It fought at the Battle of the Nile.
Well, this one, the wreck actually only happened by accident because it was a ship that was well moored, and they took the ropes off it to put onto another ship. Obviously not all of them, but it was blowing so hard that this one then went down.
Yeah, no, I think there were lots of sick on board who'd served at the Battle of the Nile, one of Nelson's victories. And nowadays, not many wrecks to report.
Not many, but this is the latest one. So the Ceta, the cargo ship that was, she ran into the back of St Mary's a few years ago. She was carrying a lot of goods for island supermarkets, and yeah, just lots of containers washing around the place.
So to this day, anytime there is a shipwreck, a little piece of it might end up here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I've ever been anywhere with this many navigational hazards. There's just rocks and sandbanks and
It's
tide rippling
completely
through.
nuts. It's completely nuts.
You've got to be on your mettle, haven't you?
Here in Scilly, there's always a hidden risk ready to catch you out.
The thing is, you can't really trust the charts because actually these sandbanks move around. They're not really that accurate. So I think the best way is just to look over the side. And luckily, the clarity of the water is just indescribable here. You can see everything, but actually, I think we've just run aground. Wow,
That's quite interesting.
clearly not the route. So I think we're going to need
Is it
to
pushing?
go this way.
The tide is going out, so every second that we're aground, there's less and less water beneath the keel. So we need to get going.
I think we might need to jump out here. I think we might have escaped. I think we're off.
Never a dull moment, is there?
How's it looking depth-wise on that side? It looks all right.
It is about 1 metre and a bit. It's about 1.5 meters. There is not much water here, and it is falling every second. We do not want to spend the night on a sandbank.
It was incredibly shallow just in on that corner. I thought we were in the right part of the channel, but clearly we weren't. What it tells us sailing in the Scillies is that everywhere there are dangers.
Even the best sailors get caught out around Scilly, but at least if you know where the coastline is, you stand a better chance of avoiding it. And key to that is lighthouses. Scilly has some of the oldest and finest in Britain. Jess Vian is a lighthouse expert and trustee at the Isles of Scilly Museum.
The first lighthouse was built on St Agnes in 1680, and it was built by Trinity House. They had some involvement in lighthouses a bit earlier, over in Lowestoft and Dungeness, but that was the first one that was built in Cornwall.
But what impact did they have?
Well, it did help. I mean, certainly it was better than nothing, but the Association disaster happened in 1707, so that was 27 years after the lighthouse was built, and wrecks did continue to happen on a fairly frequent basis, even with the lighthouse.
And why was that?
Well, it's not in a terrifically good position. It's in the middle of the island. There's quite a lot of rocks still out to the west on the other side of it. And it was only lit by a coal cresset, so the light itself wasn't very light. It was surrounded by glass, and the glass would get sooty, so a lot of time was taken to keep it ventilated and clean. So it just probably wasn't as efficient as some lighthouses were then to go on to be, but the technology just wasn't there at that point.
Although it wasn't terribly effective, the lighthouse at St Agnes saved the life of Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States, when he was on a transatlantic crossing in 1757.
The story goes that they were running from privateers, so they had a lot of sail up and they were going very fast. And navigation wasn't great in those days, they weren't quite sure where they were. And all of a sudden, as he said, they saw the light as big as a cartwheel, and it was the St Agnes light, so they were able to do an emergency manoeuvre and sail away and be safe. And afterwards he wrote to his wife and said that if he had been a Roman Catholic, he might have built a chapel to some saint, but because he wasn't, he would make a vow and encourage the building of lighthouses in America, which is what he did.
But not everyone who came close to the islands were so lucky. To this day, reminders of shipwrecks are still being found.
So these are beady pool beads, and
Look, yeah.
so these are Venetian glass that were from a wreck in the 17th century, and they are washed up primarily on St Agnes. They're this terracotta colour, but they are actually glass. They're not clay or terracotta.
Yeah.
This, which is slightly bigger, which is,
Wow.
look at that one. Now that was found the other day, actually. That is a bead from a wreck called the Douro that went down in 1843, and she was lost with all hands. When divers went down to investigate in the 1970s, they found that she was carrying beads and manillas, slave bangles, and although that wasn't on her manifest, so it looks like she was potentially involved in the illegal slave trade.
Right, okay.
So her logbook was found floating a couple of days after the wreck was discovered, and it turns out she'd sprung a leak. So I think they were just rushing to the mainland, had all their sails up, trying to get there as quickly as possible and possibly not paying as much attention as they should have done. They struck round rock and down she went.
The main lighthouse protecting the islands today is the famous Bishop Rock. Built in the mid-19th century and nearly 50 metres tall, it can be visible for many miles. Building it on a rock on the edge of the Atlantic proved to be a huge engineering challenge.
How was that built?
There's actually been 3 built over the years. First one was between 1847 and 1850, and it was like a living pod and a lantern on cast and wrought iron legs. It didn't last very long. In February of 1850, a big storm came through and just basically washed the whole thing off the rock. Luckily, nobody was on board, so there weren't any casualties. So Trinity House and their designers came up with the idea of building a stone lighthouse, much more resistant to the waves. So they came back later on in 1850 and started that, and finally was lit in 1858. And that worked great for a number of years until a couple of big storms came through in the 1870s and did quite a lot of damage. It had to be rebuilt. So the one that we see out there now was actually rebuilt between 1881 and 1888, where they encased the existing one in great big blocks of granite, and they did such a fantastic job they've never really had to touch it since.
Given today's calm weather, we can get closer to the Bishop Rock than I've ever been before.
It's an amazing thing being up close, isn't it?
It's just incredibly unnerving, actually, to be so close up to it. I mean, it's been a little while since I've been out here, but even now, just in this calm sea, it still sends a few goosebumps up my spine.
For me, it's testament to the desire to save lives and cargoes that they go to those lengths. I mean, that would be really impressive to build it today with all the techniques we have.
When you just look at the engineering feat, building that thing out on that rocky outcrop, it's astonishing, and they had to do it.
The team that built the Bishop Rock Lighthouse lived on this small island among the Western Isles. In the centre of the island, you can just about make out part of the wall from one of the huts the workers lived in. If the weather was bad, they were stuck here, unable to work or to get back to the larger islands.
And for me, it's a testament to just how seriously the government took this problem. This was a graveyard for ships, for cargoes, for people, and they went to those lengths to try and ward people off it, and it would have worked. I mean, imagine that on a stormy night at sea. As long as you can see that light and you're well south of it, you know you're going to miss the Isles of Scilly. It's amazing to think, isn't it, how many shipwrecks have struck these isles, but we just have no record of them at all. Just so much tragedy, so much suffering, and it's just been lost to historical record. It's still not easy. Even with all the technology we've got, you and I have occasionally been a bit freaked out and made a mistake and had to avoid a few things. It just shows, doesn't it? Perfect weather, very experienced skipper, all the toys, and even then it hasn't been easy.
Yeah, well, luckily we've got one of these. We've got charts, we've got buoyage, we've got all these things around us which help us navigate these islands and show us where these wrecks are.
Next time, we discover why this small, remote archipelago has such a rich military history, with defensive systems that show the evolution of warfare over the last 500 years. For hundreds of years, military planners have recognised the strategic importance of the Isles of Scilly. The island's position at the crossroads of several important trading routes made them a valuable asset for Britain that far outweighed their size and population.
There aren't many places in the British Isles where you can see the evolution of our coastal defences in this small an area. As new threats kept popping up, they kept building new fortifications.
Being out here in the middle of the Atlantic would make it pretty difficult if the islands came under attack. Support is at least 24 hours away, and that's only if favourable weather conditions are here.
Scilly has long been a target for foreign invaders. By the 16th century, protecting the coast had become vitally important. So how did these islands manage to stay under British rule, despite a multitude of threats?
I'm guiding Bounty towards one of the earliest strongholds, but first we have to edge through the rocks.
So I'm just going to start bearing away.
Do you want me to switch sides, or...?
Let's just get amongst those rocks first.
The value of the islands was summed up in 1602 by the governor of the Isles of Scilly. No other place, said Sir Francis Godolphin, can so aptly permit or restrain the traffic of Ireland or the north of Scotland with France or Spain.
Just got a little bit of enough wind, I think. The tide's coming in, so we're going to get carried down here. I think if we get the other side of this rock and then just sail up a little bit into the tide.
We're heading for Tresco, the second largest of the islands, and where the first significant defensive structure of the 16th century was built, the old blockhouse. "400 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to land as easily as this. Perched above Old Grimsby Harbour is a small Tudor fortress that would have rained down fire."
And this is fantastic. Look at these little boulders here it's being perched on.
I love the way they've built this defensive structure right on top of this really powerful, naturally occurring stone. Makes it even harder to attack. And here you can see, look at this, this is great. You've still got the gun platforms here. This is wonderful. And there would have been big heavy guns on here, cannons, sticking out through embrasures in the wall, dominating 180 degrees. And although it looks like a castle, people might say that's a castle, it's actually it's a blockhouse or a fort. It's an artillery position. This is the 16th century. Big cannon are really sort of just coming in, reaching new levels of accuracy and punch, to try and sink ships as they're approaching the shoreline. But this is a new kind of defence, and previous to this it was a matter of having men with crossbows and spears waiting on the shore for an invader. Now you try and sink, you strike them a bit further out, you sink them using cannon instead.
Who are we up against? Who are we fighting?
So in the 16th century, Europe's been thrown into turmoil. Henry VIII has taken England out of the Catholic Church. The French and the Spanish are determined to get England back into the Catholic Church. There was concerns they were going to invade. So Henry VIII and his successors build forts like this all across the south coast of England. And the Scillies is the most perfect position, because if you're travelling from France and Spain, you want to invade England, or you want to help rebel groups in Ireland or link up with the Scots, you've got to come via the Scillies. The Scillies is the centre of this crossroads. So protecting the Scillies, Tresco, St Mary's, becomes a big priority for Henry VIII and his son and his daughter.
Maritime invasion was a constant threat as continental powers sought to suppress Protestant England, and the Tudor regime tried to spread its power and influence around the world. It was exemplified by the Spanish Armada in 1588. That time, the Spanish fleet took a route south of the Scilly Isles, but this western outpost required constant protection. Our plan for Conrad is to take Bounty around the coast, while I'm going to cut inland to the highest point on the island.
See you the other side.
You get a very different sense walking over the spine of the island to what you do when you sail round the coast, but it's nice to see both aspects.
The old blockhouse wasn't the only Tudor-era defence built on Tresco in the middle of the 16th century. At the top of the hill is a much bigger fortification.
And here it is, built on pretty much the highest point of Tresco by Edward VI, Henry VIII's son. It is a big military installation, no wonder locals call it the castle. A really sizable gun battery this. It may have had 2 stories as well. And here to guard the landward defences is a guard room. This would have been full of soldiers. There'd have been loopholes they could have shot through. A gate here and a second gate here. 2 gates, but not just 2 gates. They're at right angles to another. So if a battering ram smashes through this gate here, they can't then manoeuvre it round to smash through this one here. Clever. This was the living space. This was the sort of hall where the soldiers could eat, where their food was prepared. Look at this big fireplace here. So it'd been nice and warm, even on this exposed promontory. They'd been able to heat up a little bit. And there's a bread oven there, recessed into that wall, which I love. You can imagine their bread baking in there. You've got big cannon able to command this arc of fire, completely blocking off this channel to enemy ships. That was the plan anyway. Big cannon here, each one with a crew manning it. When they were firing, it would have been deafeningly loud in this space. Smoke, acrid, in your eyes, in your ears. Guns absolutely deafening you. It just shows how important Edward VI and his advisors thought the defence of Scilly was. This is an expensive, big commitment to protecting this archipelago, and by protecting this archipelago, protecting the kingdom as well. I'm glad I rushed because there is Conrad, just sailing through now.
So here I am in the line of sight from the castle above.
The idea being that the guns in the castle would fire down onto boats like this in the bay. But there was a problem. The angle to fire into this channel was too steep, and the cannonballs would roll out of the gun before they were fired.
So Bounty would have stood a reasonable chance to live to sail another day.
When it was first built, the castle was the largest defensive structure on the islands. It didn't take long for it to be superseded. Towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, King Philip of Spain was threatening to launch ever more armadas, so the island's defences needed an upgrade. The place chosen by the military planners as having the best defensive potential to house a garrison was this headland on St Mary's.
So Conrad, you can see here on the south end of St Mary's, the government chose this position to build really quite a significant fortress known as the garrison. You can see these walls go all the way around, batteries at all the corners, which would have given a pretty comprehensive protection to anything really approaching from this angle, from this major passage into the Scillies here.
The combination of firepower and rocky coastline made this a very tough place to attack.
You can see why it was so difficult to kind of fight against, because actually you've got all the natural elements stopping you from landing anywhere.
The Woolpack battery is one of the most heavily armed parts of the garrison. It could house guns with a range of 11.5 kilometres. A little boat like Bounty wouldn't have stood a chance.
Yeah, so without the benefit of forecasts, you sort of mount your attack. You hope that there's going to be the wind that's going to carry you through here safely, and of course you get into the lee of this landmass, you get becalmed, and you're just a sitting duck. Yeah, so if we came under attack right now, we can't really sail away. The only thing we'd be able to do is to get the oars out and row, and of course that would be painfully slow.
There are so many examples of big warships deploying their crew into boats like this, hawsers attached to the front of the ships and just making them row as hard as they could. Meanwhile, there's shot falling around their ears, they're under fire. There's many examples of these kind of amphibious assaults going very badly wrong.
Terrifying.
The garrison walls were added to and constantly updated across the centuries. dating back more than 350 years, they're one of the most impressive coastal defence systems in Britain.
In the 1740s, Britain found itself at war with both France and Spain, and the decision was taken to massively upgrade the defences here in the Scillies. These outer walls were built high above Hugh-town, making sure that not only were the approaches to St Mary's guarded by cannon batteries overlooking the sea, but the landward defences were protected as well, in case a French or Spanish fleet got in here, landed troops, and they tried to take the defences from the landward side. This is the entrance to those new upgraded defences, and I like the fact that you can see above the gate GR, the initials, George Rex, for King George II.
Overlooking the harbour at the top of the hill is the most famous of all the defensive features on Scilly, originally built in Tudor times.
The linchpin of the defences of the Isles of Scilly is probably this fortress here, towering above Hugh-town, dominating St Mary's and the channels around it. This is also one of the most perfect star-shaped Renaissance forts ever built in the British Isles, Star Castle.
From above, you can see how the castle works. The 8-pointed star shape gives the castle its name, with rounded bastions replaced by angled edges.
This fort was built in the 1590s after Queen Elizabeth I had antagonised the greatest superpower in the world, the Spanish. Spanish ships were pushing towards the Scillies through the 1580s, and it was decided to reinforce the defences of these islands. Now, that means that they used the latest technology, which was a star shape, so a geometric pattern, meaning that guns and muskets could fire along all the edges of the walls. There were no blind spots, so people could sneak up on the defenders. As you move through this gateway, you're almost overwhelmed with the defensive features. First of all, you've got a gate here itself, then you've got these embrasures through which defenders could shoot muskets or other weapons. Secondly, you've got these big, thick walls. I'm really struck by how thick they are, so enemy artillery are going to have a very tough time pounding through them. And speaking of artillery, this is a murderous feature here. It's been bricked up now, but this was a loophole through which a heavier gun like a cannon could shoot as people are coming in here, raining down death and destruction on anyone unlucky enough to be caught in this killing zone. Star Castle is a very smart hotel now, so it's obviously very beautiful up here, but you still can see the layout of its original military purpose. You've got embrasures here in these walls. These were for cannon, but also smaller weapons like muskets that could shoot along the walls, picking off any attackers. And what a position. We're high on the top of St Mary's. I can see Hugh-town down there dominating the port and the town below. Anything that happens on the island, you'll know about it up here first. This is such a neat, powerful, compact fort. Obviously, walls are only as good as the people protecting them. But in terms of the 1590s, this was about as impregnable as money could buy.
The fortress was perfectly designed for the age of gunpowder.
Wow, this is the powder magazine. This is where the gunpowder is stored, and it's state of the art, so cleverly designed. It's sunk down into the hillside to keep out the way of any cannonballs that are flying around up there. And if any cannonballs do come near it, they will strike this big thick outer wall and the shock will dissipate in this corridor entirely surrounding the building. Let's take a look inside. This is the heart of the complex, the actual powder store itself. So powerfully built. Look at these huge thick walls. A raised floor here so that it can be ventilated, so that there's no moisture in here. You need that powder dry, of course. Vents here, again, to circulate the air and stop that build-up of moisture. And here you get a reconstruction of what it would have looked like. Barrels and barrels of gunpowder. This was the vital ingredient if you were going to protect this fort, indeed the Isles of Scilly. You needed gunpowder to fire the cannon and the muskets. But that meant this place was extremely dangerous. One spark and this could get blown sky high, and there are lots of examples of that in fortresses in this period. So the people in here would have had to creep around, be very careful they didn't accidentally set anything off. They'd have worn special footwear and been highly trained.
The threats of foreign invaders taking over never materialised. Perhaps any would-be attackers were put off, not only by the fortifications, but also by the great challenges of navigating the island's hidden reefs and rocky outcrops.
It's a huge sort of reef, 10 miles spread, at the very doorstep to England.
Exactly that, exactly that. And if you think, our prevailing winds are southwesterly, so the Spanish, the French, if they're coming round that corner of Brittany, they're being blown in this direction. And if they don't really know where they are, and they're not certain, they could easily find themselves in amongst all of this.
Ironically, when shots were finally fired in anger on the islands, it was Englishman on Englishman in the Civil War. The islands were controlled by forces loyal to the king for most of the conflict, a distant outpost as fighting raged across Britain. This is Cromwell's castle. It was built by Admiral Robert Blake, who was sent by the English Parliament to capture Scilly from the Royalists. Blake took control of the islands in the spring of 1651, launching an assault first on Tresco and Briar, before defeating the Royalist forces on St Mary's. He built the castle shortly after, an ominous bastion to defend Parliament's new territory.
To get into the big round tower, you have to come onto this gun platform here. This may have been here at the time, but it was certainly expanded and rebuilt in the 18th century. This great big round tower definitely does date from the Civil War. Inside you can see the real cross-section of the building here. Down there was the basement, storage area for food, as well as those all-important cannonballs and gunpowder. Here there was one level and another story just above my head here. That was for accommodation. And then look at this, cleverly reinforced vaulted ceiling, because on top of there were the big heavy guns. And this is the roof, the gun platform, and you can see it's built for all-round defence, cannons facing in every way, inland and out to sea. Each one of these cannons would have a crew of at least 3 people, so you can imagine how busy it would have been up here if they were really defending the castle against a determined enemy. Very thick walls protecting the crews. And up here, a lookout point. So the lookout up here is able to see the fall of shot, and he's able to correct it, so he'd correct the aim of the men down there, calling right a bit, left a bit, up and down. What a view.
The castle made sure no ships could get through this deep water channel on the western side of Tresco. The Civil War ended soon after the castle was built, and despite many threats, it wasn't until the 20th century and the First World War that the islands saw any further conflict. The Isles of Scilly now sat on the front line of the war in the North Atlantic, as German U-boats tried to sink Allied shipping, bringing vital supplies to Britain.
On the 27th of May 1917, this narrow channel between Tresco and Briar came under attack.
A German U-boat surfaced off Briar. It was spotted by a flying boat that was on patrol from its base on Tresco.
The U-boat fired first, hitting the starboard radiator, but the flying boat fought back, dropping 2 bombs in what eyewitnesses thought was a direct hit. The U-boat was never seen again. Its status still remains a mystery.
The seaplanes were based here at the village of New Grimsby on Tresco. The airbase meant British air defences could reach further out into the western approaches to stop submarines. Little evidence of it remains today, but you can still make out the concrete footings of some of the accommodation blocks.
When war broke out again 20 years later, the positional importance of Scilly wasn't missed by Hitler's forces either. At the time, the islands were virtually undefended, with no anti-aircraft cover and no significant naval presence. The Luftwaffe first attacked in August 1940, scoring a direct hit on a radio direction finding station. The British had to decide whether to try and hold on to the islands or to give them up to invading forces. The island's future hung in the balance.
On the 30th of August 1940, the security of Scilly was discussed at the War Cabinet, and Winston Churchill ordered that they were to be defended at all costs.
Reinforcements were quickly sent, including 2 destroyers that were anchored in the bay off Hughtown. A year later, they were backed up by a squadron of Hurricanes, while the beaches were wired and military fortifications erected. This is one of 30 pillboxes that were built on the islands. Kate Hale, the curator of the Isles of Scilly Museum, is taking me to one that protects the south of the islands.
The islands were bombed quite heavily in 1940, and I think there was a reaction to that, and they were seen to be strategically important in a way that perhaps they hadn't quite gathered at the beginning. So it was because of the defences going in and the Hurricane Squadron arriving that Scilly became safe. But up until then it had been quite a serious target. Several bombs dropped in those early days. 400 people left the islands in 1940, feeling it was so unsafe.
And so these pillboxes were sort of guarding beaches and coves, anywhere where the Germans might perhaps try a landing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this pillbox is that it's sort of back to front. You'd expect the entrance to the pillbox to be inland, but we think that the rocks here were seen as such a good defence that any attack would have been once the Germans had come into the bays, and so the gun points face inland, which is quite unusual.
I did not notice that. That's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about the legacy of the Second World War in Scilly? You said lots of people left. I mean, did it damage the economy and damage life here?
It would have been unrecognisable at the time. The beaches would have had barbed wire on them, the pillboxes. The people living on Scilly were totally different. A particular woman, Marjorie Williams, wrote a poem about what life was like in Scilly during the war. And she came back afterwards and noticed the difference, that you experience Scilly as such a peaceful place. But at the time of the Second World War, it had a very different feel. And I'll just read a few lines. Does the memory still linger of our years spent in the service of our country upon your sea-kissed shores, when naval ships lay moored along your quay, waiting the call to seaward, calm or storm, to rescue fallen aircrew from the waves or clutch torpedo mariners from death?
The end of the war in 1945 brought Scilly's long military history to a close. Ever since, the islands have been a haven for visitors, many of whom come because there's so much history packed into such a small place.
One of my favourite historical legends in the Scilly Isles is that the Scillies were at war with the Dutch for 335 years, from 1651 until very recently when there was a peace treaty. And it's odd to have a war between a part of England and a foreign country, but it does stem back 1651. A Dutch admiral arrived here, and it had been a sort of hive, a refuge for British royalist privateers, pirates, troops preying on Dutch shipping. And he sort of arrived, this Dutch admiral, and said, "We demand reparations.
Enough's enough.
Enough's enough." And for the next 335 years, even though no one really noticed, they argue technically Holland was at war with the Scilly Isles.
What a great story.
It's a good story. It's a good story. But it is a reminder of the importance of these islands. You know, they really matter to foreign powers, to England. You know, they are a safe harbour at the very mouth of the world's busiest shipping lane, the English Channel. And who controls these islands historically has been a big deal. You've got Dutch fleets here, you've got the French and Spanish threatening them.
Yeah, I think if I was a skipper around that time, I'd think very carefully about trying to take over these islands. They're a challenge in their own right.
Yeah, they're a safe haven surrounded by loads of navigational hazards, slap bang at the crossroads of Europe's history.
Our journey around Scilly has come to an end. These islands are ever changing, constantly adapting to the challenges of life on the fringes of Britain and the edge of the Atlantic. From tragic shipwrecks to ancient civilizations, Arthurian legends to great coastal castles, to magic archipelago that has stood witness to history.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.